In the crisp, fading light of October 12, 1971, 23-year-old Florence Darby walked onto the gravel lot of a farm liquidation in the Willamette Valley with a heavy canvas bank bag clutched firmly in her right hand. The air was thick with the smell of crushed dry leaves, spilled diesel fuel, and the quiet desperation of an era coming to an end. This was not an auction. There was no fast-talking man with a gavel drumming up excitement, no bidding wars, no theatrical displays of wealth. This was a grim, quiet liquidation, a private treaty sale orchestrated by a sterile bank from the city to carve up the bones of the old Miller estate. The old man had passed away in the spring, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a sprawling farm that the bank was now tearing apart piece by piece. The gravel yard was crowded with men in heavy denim and canvas coats, local farmers and equipment dealers who had come like crows to a carcass, picking over the shiny, modern equipment that had been dragged out of the main barns and lined up for inspection. Florence did not stop to look at the gleaming green tractors with their polished cabs, nor did she pause at the rows of pristine plows and newly painted cedars. She walked with a steady, measured pace, her work boots crunching softly against the gravel, moving straight past the crowd of men who barely registered her presence. She was a young woman in a man's world, a ghost moving through a landscape of heavy machinery and aggressive commerce. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of her father's old wool jacket, her eyes fixed on the far back corner of the property. There, hidden behind a rotting wooden fence and half buried in a tangled sea of blackberry brambles and tall, dead weeds, sat the graveyard. 7 massive red combines sat sinking into the soft Oregon mud. They were hulking, silent beasts, their paint fading under the relentless sun and rain, their metal skins scarred by rust and neglect. To the men gathered in the main yard, these machines were worse than garbage. They were a known catastrophe. They were a specific model released a few years prior that had become infamous across the agricultural world. The manufacturer had promised a revolution in harvesting, but instead, they had delivered a mechanical nightmare. The hydrostatic transmissions were said to blow under heavy load, and the main rotor bearings had a reputation for shattering mid-harvest, taking the entire engine block with them. Dealers had abandoned them. Farmers had cursed them. The bank had written them off entirely, leaving them in the weeds to rot because the cost of towing them to a scrapyard exceeded the value of their metal. Florence stood before the first machine, a towering silhouette of dead steel. She reached out, her calloused fingers brushing against the cold, rusted side panel. The metal was rough, textured by years of exposure, but beneath the decay, the bones of the machine were solid. She did not see a graveyard. She saw a dormant army. She turned and walked back toward the front of the property, where a man in a sharp gray suit stood behind a folding table, holding a clipboard and looking miserable in the autumn chill. He was the liquidator, a man who dealt in numbers and ledgers, not soil and sweat. Florence stopped in front of his table, pulled the heavy canvas bag from her pocket, and dropped it onto the wood with a dull, heavy thud. "I want the 7 red combines in the back weeds," she said. The liquidator looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at his ledger, running a manicured finger down a column of typed numbers. He found the entry, marked with a red asterisk denoting 0 asset value. He looked back up at Florence, his expression shifting from confusion to mild amusement. "Those machines are condemned, miss," the liquidator said. "They do not run. They will never run. The bank is only accepting offers on the functional equipment. I am offering $2,000 in cash for all 7, as they sit," Florence replied, her voice calm and entirely devoid of hesitation. The sound of the canvas bag hitting the table had drawn the attention of the men nearby. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Men turned away from the shiny green tractors to look at the young woman standing at the folding table. Among them was Mr. Elias Thorne. Elias was the largest equipment dealer in the Willamette Valley. He was a man who built his empire on the backs of farmers, selling them the newest, most expensive machinery on crushing, high-interest credit. He was a man who believed that farming was no longer about the land, but about leverage. He wore a heavy gold watch that flashed in the fading sunlight, and his boots were always remarkably clean for a man who spent his life around dirt. Elias Thorne pushed his way to the front of the crowd, a wide, condescending smile spreading across his face. He looked at Florence, then at the canvas bag, and finally out toward the back weeds where the red beast slumbered. He let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed across the gravel yard. "Tong na you bought yourself a graveyard, little girl," Elias said, his voice dripping with theatrical pity. "Those red monsters are dead. Their transmissions are made of glass, and their rotors are cursed. You just handed this bank $2,000 for the privilege of owning a mountain of worthless scrap." The crowd of men joined in his laughter. It was a cruel, collective sound, the sound of established experts mocking the foolishness of an outsider. They laughed because they knew the conventional wisdom. They knew what the magazines said, what the mechanics said, and what the dealers like Elias Thorne preached as gospel. They laughed because the idea of a young woman buying 7 condemned machines was absurd. Florence did not flush. She did not look away. She turned her head slowly and met Elias Thorne's gaze. Her eyes were dark, quiet, and ancient in their stillness. "They just need a little listening to," Florence said. She turned back to the liquidator, who was already counting the crisp $20 and $50 bills from the canvas bag. He stamped a piece of paper, scribbled a signature, and handed Florence the bill of sale. She folded the paper, placed it carefully into her breast pocket, and walked away from the laughing crowd, stepping back into the shadows of the falling dusk. Let me tell you about Florence Darby. She was not a fool, and she was not acting on a whim. She was the only daughter of Arthur Darby, a man who had farmed a small, stubborn patch of the valley for 40 years. Arthur was a quiet master of the physical world. He was a man who possessed esoteric, ancestral knowledge, a philosophy of life and labor that he had hammered into his daughter from the moment she was old enough to hold a wrench. Arthur did not believe in the modern religion of debt. He viewed debt like a storm, a dark cloud that could wash away a lifetime of labor in a single season. He believed that the soil was a living thing, and that machinery was merely an extension of the human hand, subject to the same laws of respect and discipline. Arthur had taught Florence not by lecturing her in a classroom, but by making her stand beside him in his unheated workshop through countless freezing winters. He taught her to diagnose a failing engine by the smell of its exhaust and the rhythm of its vibration. He taught her that metal speaks if you have the patience to listen. He taught her that conventional wisdom is often just collective ignorance, repeated loudly enough to sound like the truth. When Arthur died suddenly of a heart failure the year before, he did not leave Florence a vast estate or a modern fleet of tractors. He left her the small, debt-free farm, a beautifully maintained set of hand tools, and a stack of leather-bound mechanical journals. These journals were the tangible legacy of his mind. They were filled with meticulous handwritten notes, hand-drawn diagrams, and observations about every piece of machinery he had ever encountered. Arthur had spent the last 2 years of his life obsessed with the very red combines that now sat rotting in the Miller estate weeds. Now, let me explain the secret. The collective wisdom of the valley, the dealers, and the manufacturers dictated that the red combines were fundamentally flawed, victims of catastrophic engineering failure. But Arthur Darby had spent months studying a broken one that a desperate neighbor had abandoned. He had taken the entire hydrostatic transmission apart, laying every gear, seal, and bearing out on his wooden workbench. He had spent weeks staring at the metal, measuring tolerances with a micrometer and tracing the flow of hydraulic fluid. Arthur had discovered the truth. The flaw was not catastrophic. It was embarrassing. The manufacturer had installed a cheap, badly designed bypass valve in the hydraulic line leading to the main rotor. When the combine hit a heavy patch of damp grain, the pressure would spike. Instead of venting the pressure safely, this cheap valve would jam shut, sending a massive shockwave of hydraulic force directly back into the transmission seals and the rotor bearings, blowing them to pieces. The dealers saw the blown transmissions and blamed the heavy components. They told the farmers the machines were weak. But Arthur realized that if you simply removed the faulty bypass valve and replaced it with a custom machined steel bracket and a heavier-duty pressure relief valve, a modification that cost exactly $14 in parts, the pressure issue vanished entirely. The transmission was actually overbuilt, incredibly strong, and completely reliable once that single tiny bottleneck was removed. Arthur had written this down in his journal. He had drawn the exact dimensions of the required bracket. He had noted the exact part number for the replacement valve. He had solved the mystery that the highly paid engineers back east had missed. He died before he could ever buy one of the machines to prove it. Florence knew the secret. When she handed over that $2,000, she was not gambling. She was executing her father's final, unwritten will. The subsequent 3 years were a master class in brutal, solitary discipline. Florence did not hire a crew. She did not take out a loan to pay for transportation. She borrowed an ancient, heavy-duty tow truck from a sympathetic scrap hauler, trading him 2 weeks of labor on his own engines for the use of the rig. Over the course of the freezing winter of 1971, she dragged those 7 massive red beasts, one by one, out of the blackberry brambles and down the county roads to her father's barn. The physical toll was immense. The Willamette Valley winters are unforgiving, characterized by a bone-chilling, relentless rain that turns the earth into a thick, sucking mud. Florence worked in an unheated barn, the wind whistling through the gaps in the wooden siding. Her hands were permanently stained with black grease and etched with deep, painful cracks from the cold. She worked by the pale yellow light of a single incandescent bulb, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She stripped the first combine down to its skeleton. She pulled the massive header off, disconnected the hydraulic lines, and hoisted the heavy rotor assembly out using a rusted chain fall hung from the barn's main beam. It was agonizing, slow work. Every bolt was seized with rust. Every joint fought her. She spent entire days just applying penetrating oil and applying heat from a small acetylene torch, waiting for the metal to yield. The community watched from a distance, and the whispers grew. Neighbors driving past her farm would see the massive red hulks sitting in her yard and shake their heads. They talked at the local diner, over bitter coffee and plates of eggs. They said the Darby girl had lost her mind with grief. They said she was wasting her youth on a fool's errand. Elias Thorne made a point to mention her to his customers, using her as a cautionary tale. He would stand in his warm, brightly lit showroom, pointing out the window toward her side of the valley, and tell farmers that this was what happened when you refused to embrace modern credit and new machinery. You ended up playing in the mud with dead iron. There was a moment, in the dead of February in 1972, when Florence nearly broke. She was working on the 3rd machine. The temperature had dropped into the teens, and a bitter frost coated the inside of the barn windows. She was trying to align the custom steel bracket her father had designed, lying on her back on the freezing concrete floor, her muscles screaming from exhaustion. The heavy wrench slipped from her numb fingers, striking her squarely on the cheekbone. The pain was sharp and blinding. She lay there in the dirt, the smell of old diesel and cold dust in her nose, and she felt the crushing weight of isolation. The silence of the barn was absolute. She thought of the men laughing in the gravel yard. She thought of the sheer scale of the task ahead of her. 4 more machines to go. thousands of pounds of dead steel. She closed her eyes, letting a single tear mix with the grease on her face. And then, in the quiet dark, she heard the memory of her father's voice. "Metal does not care about your feelings, Florence," the memory said. "It only cares about the truth of the turn. Find the truth." Florence opened her eyes. She wiped her face with the back of her heavy sleeve. She reached out, picked up the cold iron wrench, and tightened the bolt. She did not stop again. When spring arrived, she put fresh diesel in the first machine, bled the fuel lines, and turned the key. The massive diesel engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. The sound was deafening, a deep rhythmic thrumming that shook the dust from the barn rafters. Thick black smoke shot from the exhaust stack, slowly clearing to a steady, invisible haze. Florence engaged the modified hydraulic system. She held her breath as the pressure built. She engaged the main rotor. The machine purred. There was no shudder. There was no catastrophic explosion. The $14 fix held perfectly. The beast was alive. She did not celebrate. She simply shut the machine down, covered it with a heavy canvas tarp, and moved on to the next one. She repeated this process through the winters of 1972, 1973, and 1974. She scavenged parts, she machined new fittings, she cleaned carburetors, and she replaced dry-rotted belts. By the time the harvest of 1905 arrived, Florence Darby had a fleet of 7 perfectly functional, incredibly powerful red combines sitting quietly in the back of her property, hidden beneath heavy tarps. She continued to farm her own small acreage, keeping her head down, living frugally, and waiting. The land remembered, and the economy turned. Then, in 1980, the storm that Arthur Darby had always predicted finally broke over the valley. It was the beginning of the great farm crisis. Interest rates skyrocketed to unprecedented, suffocating levels, reaching past 20%. The easy credit that had fueled the agricultural boom of the 1970s suddenly became a hangman's noose. The price of grain plummeted due to international embargoes, while the cost of fuel and fertilizer doubled. The farmers who had laughed at Florence, the men who had listened to Elias Thorne and financed fleets of shiny green tractors on floating interest rates, found themselves drowning. The bank that had liquidated the Miller estate was now sending men in sharp suits to every farm in the county. Foreclosure notices were nailed to wooden fence posts. Repo trucks arrived in the dead of night to drag away the expensive machinery. By the time the autumn harvest approached, the Willamette Valley was facing a catastrophe. The fields were golden, heavy with grain that needed to be cut, but there were no machines left to cut it. The dealers' lots were overflowing with repossessed equipment that no one could afford to buy or lease. The crops were going to rot in the fields, and with them, the last hopes of dozens of generational family farms. Despair hung over the county like a thick fog. It was then that Florence Darby pulled the heavy canvas tarps off her fleet. She drove the first red combine out of her barn, the massive engine roaring with a healthy, unstoppable power. Behind her, she had hired 6 local men who had lost their own farms to the bank to drive the other 6. The procession of 7 massive red machines rolled out onto the county highway, their tires humming against the asphalt. They looked like a resurrected army marching to war. Florence did not gloat. She did not exploit the desperation of her neighbors. She drove her fleet from farm to farm, offering a simple deal. She would harvest their fields using her machines. She charged a fair, flat rate, lower than any commercial harvesting crew, and she accepted her payment in a percentage of the grain, not cash. She required no credit checks, no bank signatures, no interest rates. The red combines proved themselves to be magnificent beasts of burden. With the fatal flaw removed, they chewed through the heaviest, dampest grain the Oregon autumn could throw at them. They ran day and night, their headlights cutting through the dusk, their engines never faltering. The modified hydraulic systems held strong, just as Arthur Darby's journal had promised. Florence's fleet single-handedly saved the valley's harvest that year. She filled the local silos. She allowed families to pay off their immediate debts and keep their land for one more winter. She became the undeniable master of the valley's harvest. Because she owned the machines free and clear, without a single cent of debt attached to them, her overhead was practically non-existent. The grain she took as payment was stored, sold when the market stabilized, and turned into quiet, solid wealth. The vindication was absolute, but Florence remained the same observant, quiet woman she had always been. She still wore her father's old wool jacket. She still checked her own oil. Mr. Elias Thorne did not fare as well. The farm crisis shattered his empire. The bank seized his dealership, locking the doors and chaining the gates. His inventory of overpriced, overfinanced machinery sat rusting on the lot, monuments to a failed philosophy. His tailored suits grew slightly frayed at the cuffs, and the heavy gold watch disappeared from his wrist, sold to cover legal fees. One damp afternoon in late November, long after the harvest was finished and the fields were bare, a rusted sedan pulled into Florence's farmyard. Florence was standing by the open doors of her barn, wiping grease from a heavy wrench with a red rag. She watched as Elias Thorne stepped out of the car. He looked older, smaller, stripped of the arrogant bluster that had defined him a decade earlier. He walked slowly across the yard, stopping a few feet from where Florence stood. He looked past her, into the dim light of the barn, where the 7 red combines sat cleanly parked, fully serviced, and ready for the next year. Elias stood in silence for a long time. He looked at the massive tires, the clean hydraulic lines, the sheer undeniable reality of their existence. He swallowed hard, his throat working. "How did you know?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The manufacturers couldn't fix them. My best mechanics couldn't fix them. We all said they were dead. How did you know they would run?" Florence stopped wiping the wrench. She looked at the broken man standing before her. She did not feel anger, nor did she feel a need to crush him. She simply felt the weight of the truth. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, blue, canvas-covered journal, its pages stained with oil and time. She held it up between them. "My father listened before you told everyone to stop," Florence said quietly. "He found the truth of the turn." Elias stared at the small book. He realized in that moment the depth of his own ignorance. He had spent his life selling people things they didn't understand, based on promises written by men who didn't care. This young woman had spent her life understanding the things she owned. "I was wrong," Elias said, the words catching in his throat. "I was wrong to laugh at you. I was wrong about all of it." He extended a trembling, calloused hand. Florence looked at it for a moment, then reached out and took it. It was a firm, brief handshake. There was no forgiveness, nor was there condemnation. It was simply an acknowledgement of reality. Elias turned and walked back to his rusted car, leaving with nothing but the crushing weight of having been fundamentally wrong. The subsequent 2 decades were a testament to the power of patience and deep knowledge. Florence Darby did not just survive the crisis, she thrived in its aftermath. As the valley slowly recovered, she expanded her operations, buying up parcels of land entirely in cash. She never took out a mortgage. She never financed a piece of equipment. She built a massive, state-of-the-art maintenance shop, but she always kept the 7 red combines in immaculate working order. They became legends in the county, symbols of a stubborn, brilliant resilience. By the time Florence reached her 60s, she was universally regarded as the respected elder of the Willamette agricultural community. Men who had once laughed at her now came to her for advice on soil management, on machinery purchases, and on the timing of the markets. She would listen to them quietly, often diagnosing their problems before they even finished speaking. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Have you ever stood in the freezing mud, holding a cold piece of iron, while the entire world told you that you were a fool? Florence had. And because she had, she now owned the valley's harvest. In the late autumn of 2005, 34 years after that quiet liquidation sale, Florence stood in the doorway of her expansive, well-lit workshop. The air was crisp, smelling of rain and crushed dry leaves, just as it had on that day so long ago. Beside her stood her nephew, a young man of 22, who had come to work the farm and learn the trade. He was staring at one of the original red combines, which was still used every season to cut the most difficult fields. "Aunt Florence," the nephew asked, running his hand along the painted steel, "why do we still use these old machines when we could afford the new ones with the computers and the air-conditioned cabs?" Florence smiled, a faint, wise expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the old, blue canvas journal. She handed it to the young man. He took it reverently, feeling the weight of the history in its pages. "Because a shiny cab doesn't cut the grain," Florence said, her voice steady and clear. "And a computer cannot hear the metal strain. These machines belong to us. We understand their heartbeat. We do not owe the bank for their labor, and we do not owe the dealer for their permission to run. They are ours, free and clear." She placed her hand on the young man's shoulder and turned him toward the vast golden fields that stretched out toward the horizon, rippling in the wind like a sea of wealth. "Never forget the lesson of this metal," she told him. "The dealer told the valley that debt was the only way to grow. The experts told the valley that these machines were worthless scrap. The crowd laughed because it is easier to laugh than it is to work in the cold. But the dealer lost his empire, the experts lost their farms, and the crowd lost their harvest. We kept the machines, we kept the land, and the land remembered. This is the fundamental truth of the world. Quick profits and loud opinions will always crumble under the weight of time. It is the quiet, patient labor, the deep understanding of the work, and the absolute refusal to surrender your independence to those who wish to own you that builds a legacy. The world will always try to sell you a shortcut, wrapped in shiny paint and easy monthly payments. But true wealth, the kind of wealth that survives the storms and feeds the valley, is built one cold wrench turn at a time by those who have the courage to listen when everyone else is shouting. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one.